As more and more international peacekeepers become involved in scandals ranging from sex abuses to smuggling, the UN has vowed zero tolerance towards the guilty. But can the organization really prevent this misconduct? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Imran Garda. They're supposed to help prevent violence, and now they're accused of causing it. United Nations peacekeepers in the Ivory Coast are facing accusations they've abused local women. The UN plans to send investigators from their internal oversight offices to the Ivory Coast next week. They look into allegations of sexual misconduct by UN peacekeeping forces. More than 700 Moroccan peacekeepers in the Ivory Coast are now confined to their barracks. They're allowed out only to do their essential duties. This after charges they sexually exploited women, some of them as young as 13. Well, the UN has said it has a zero tolerance for any abuses carried out by its peacekeeping forces. In a press conference on Wednesday, Jane Hall-Lute said, "We are not turning a blind eye to any activity anywhere. When investigations are conducted and it is demonstrated that the allegations are founded, we will take action." UN troops have faced numerous allegations of serious abuse or sexual exploitation over the last 3 years, leading to over 140 dismissals. And in Kosovo, UN forces were found to be making money by trafficking prostitutes. In November 2006, it was discovered that UN troops in Liberia had given food to teenage refugees in return for sex. Allegations of rape and serious sexual abuse came to light in Haiti in 2005, while in Ivory Coast, 18 UN peacekeepers were reprimanded for instances of sexual exploitation and abuse. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a pedophile ring was exposed in early 2005, implicating peacekeeping troops. And an internal UN investigation this month found that peacekeepers in Congo had also colluded to smuggle gold out of the country. Well, joining us now are our guests in Beirut, Timur Göksel, former senior advisor of UNIFIL and currently a professor at Notre Dame University and the American University of Beirut. In Nairobi, Salim Lone, African affairs expert and columnist for the Daily Nation newspaper in Kenya. And in New York, Marian Molman, she is advocacy director of the Women's Rights Division at the Human Rights Watch. Thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Göksel, if I could start with you first, sir. How tarnished is the image of the UN after what seems to be a catalogue of abuses or allegations of abuses?
It's tarnished because UN doesn't seem to care. It's unbelievable that peacekeeping that started in 1956 has to be in this shape in the last couple of years. So there is something very seriously wrong, not with the peacekeeping concept, but the way this whole thing is managed. I have to put the blame on this on the top management of whoever is running this organization at the moment. It's unbelievable that the UN could allow such things to go on unchecked. I served in South Lebanon peacekeeping for 24 years. We were chasing after people who were soldiers who were selling 2 kilos of rice or 1 bottle of oil or what have you. And we had no tolerance for that. And how is it possible that now we are being told that it's a zero tolerance? Does it mean that we had tolerance until now? Why is it tolerated? Why is it allowed to come to this point when a whole battalion has to be grounded? This is unheard of in peacekeeping history. I find this very, I mean, soldiers will be soldiers. They need to be controlled. Not all are the same disciplined, but they have to be checked. And that is the job of the UN administration, the UN structure. There are UN supervisors of these missions. There should be either a special representative of the Secretary General. There is a force commander in some cases, both of them. Excuse me, if you want to stop this thing, first start by those people. They are not doing their jobs.
Ms. Molman, in New York City, how damning is the evidence against the Moroccan peacekeepers in this latest episode in the Ivory Coast?
Well, I think we need to see what the investigations of the UN are bringing up. We have sort of 4 recurring concerns with these types of investigations. The first is that there is often no transparency in how the investigations are carried out, what abuses are covered. Often the investigations are very slow to progress indeed when there are people waiting for justice to be done. The third concern we have is a very narrow, often, conclusion of the investigations when there is evidence for for a much broader conclusion and for many more people to be implicated. And the last and perhaps the most serious concern we have is, of course, that there is accountability for these very serious crimes. And I want to say that in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, I think there's good news and there's bad news. And the good news is that some of our concerns do seem to be addressed at the very least. There is now, we understand, investigators going in from the Office of Internal Oversight Services next week to Côte d'Ivoire. This is, as I understand, just 2 weeks after the allegations were brought, which is not swift enough, but it's certainly swifter than in other cases. We also understand that the Department for Field Services has asked for information from other organizations, including our own, and we certainly welcome this opening and sort of a bit of overcoming the lack of transparency in other investigations. The bad news, however, in Côte d'Ivoire is that what we're seeing is really just the tip of the iceberg of the sexual abuse that women in Côte d'Ivoire have suffered over years. There's sexual abuse committed by government forces, sexual abuse committed by the opposition forces, and what we're dealing with here is sexual abuse by those people that were brought in precisely to protect civilians in Côte d'Ivoire, including women and children that are now the victims of this abuse. So I think that what we would like to see is a much broader investigation, a much broader concern on the part of the international community with the sexual violence and abuse that women in Côte d'Ivoire have suffered for years.
Mr. Salim Loan, I've got a quote from Yusuf Omar, the head of UNICEF in the Ivory Coast. He said, for many of the girls, this is survival sex. My question is poverty at the root of the problem then, if this is survival sex? Is it maybe not a relationship of convenience for the troops and the girls?
Well, I mean, that's inevitable. You know, in every situation where peacekeepers are, these are devastated societies. They're refugees, they're displaced people. These are the poorest of the poor, caught in circumstances which make them even more vulnerable. So, on the one hand, all of us, as we're saying, ask the UN, please do more, do it more quickly. We must prevent these things from happening. But at the same time, I do think that the UN itself has raised the bar too high. By talking about zero tolerance, zero impunity, which of course is required, but emphasizing it, they seem to have lost sight of the fact that these are human beings working in very difficult circumstances. I mean, we see whenever soldiers go to war, they do terrible things, Abu Ghraib, My Lai, etc. We all know that, and we need to understand that the soldiers are subject to such pressures that they frequently end up doing such deeds, and we need to prepare them much better for these conditions. It is not enough merely to condemn the soldiers. Now, I do know that it seems to have taken quite a long time for the UN to move hard and fast on this issue. This has been going on for at least, of this scope, issues of this scope, for at least 4 years. But now they have taken numerous steps. In the last year and a year and a half, they have taken numerous steps to try to address it. You know, people have been dismissed, there are new rules, and there's new kinds of training. Ms. Lute herself is about to travel to many troop-contributing countries to make sure that national authorities, who are ultimately responsible for their troops and under whose supervision they work in the field also, take this message on. But I do want to emphasize that whenever there are soldiers in war situations, beginning, of course, from Greece and Rome, beginning from Vietnam and Saigon and Bangkok, there are going to be these very difficult situations, and we must try to work with the soldiers. It is easy enough and right to condemn them, but we must also work with them. This is not going to go away very quickly. And I believe some of the high moral tone some of us adopt, while important, is actually missing the issue. For example, you know, we talk about crimes against humanity and crimes against minors, but then prostitution is a different kind of crime. I mean, prostitution is accepted in many societies and is in fact legal in many countries. So we need to look at this issue in a little more depth for its complexity, rather than merely condemning it and saying we want this to end completely. It is never going to end completely. We must try our best, but we should not be too hard. I believe the UN has raised too many expectations with its own language, and I believe there's also pressure from powerful member states like the US, which of course is a very strong conservative lobby, which is pushing on issues like this, when in fact then you discover some of these people themselves are up to no good, so to speak.
All right, let's elaborate a little bit about the pressures that these men face and the psyche of them. Mr. Goksel, from your years of experience, give us some insight into the mind of a peacekeeper and some of the pressures they would come across. Do many of them not understand their role?
No, they do actually. It all depends. No, I shouldn't say that. It all depends on the nationality you are dealing with. Look, you have very diverse forces making up a UN peacekeeping force in any place in the world. For example, the current UNIFIL in South Lebanon has 30 countries, which is a nightmare in itself. You have very different mindsets, training, doctrines, discipline, officer quality. Everything is so different. Therefore, the force commander, the first command of a UN, has to play a unifying role. And the soldiers usually are giving some very, depending, as I said, on the nationality involved, they are not all that well trained for peacekeeping and what to expect. But what happens is, Salim is very correct. I mean, you come to a war-wrecked country and there is despair, there is poverty, there is everything. And the soldiers sometimes feel that they rule the place, because they have the guns, they have the organization, and my God, they have the money, which nobody has locally. So depending on the society where they are serving, there are tendencies to abuse this, exploit this. It's human in a way, I understand that, but we are not going to overcome this. As I remember in Cambodia, where we had a massive UN peacekeeping force, and there was a lot of stories about prostitution, gambling, etc. There, the same stories that you are hearing now. And the top representative of the Secretary General, he tried to explain this by saying boys will be boys. No, excuse me, that is the wrong approach. Yes, of course boys will be boys, but there is a UN organization involved here. We need a bit more concern, a bit more care, and maybe a bit more tough line with the troop contributing countries. I'm not dealing with it. I mean, as Mr. Salim said also, I'm not going after the troops individually here, but their leadership, their own commands have to be brought in line. And there are ways of doing this, although UN doesn't have very strong sanctions, but there are ways. And one of the most effective ways of controlling this and making sure that those contingents show some concern and some sensitivity is to threaten them, to expose them. And this is the nightmare of most troop contributed countries, to be exposed for doing something like this, because then they're afraid of going back home because it hurts their national image, national dignity, etc. So you don't have technical sanctions, but you do have weapons as UN.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. Time for a short break. When we come back, we discuss what possible steps the UN should take to put an end to abuses by its troops. Do stay with us.